The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Family Restaurant buzzed with their familiar electric hum, casting harsh shadows across the cracked vinyl booths and worn linoleum floors. Outside, the December wind rattled the plate glass windows, sending brittle leaves skittering across the empty parking lot like scattered thoughts. Inside, the dinner rush had long since faded, leaving behind only the lingering scent of coffee and the quiet desperation that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chun moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her sneakers silent against the floor as she collected abandoned coffee cups and crumpled napkins. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, secured with a pencil she'd stolen from the hostess station, and her uniform, a faded green polo with Murphy's embroidered in cheerful yellow thread, had seen better days. Much like everything else in her life, she thought bitterly as she balanced 3 plates on her left arm and reached for a 4th. The restaurant was nearly empty now, save for old Mr. Peterson nursing his 3rd cup of decaf in the corner booth and a young couple sharing a piece of apple pie that had probably been sitting under the heat lamp since Tuesday. Sarah glanced at the clock above the register, 9:47. 13 more minutes, and she could hang up her apron for the last time. Nobody knew yet. Not Dolores, the night manager who spent more time on her phone than actually managing. Not Miguel, the line cook who always saved her the good fries when she worked doubles. Not even Janet, the other waitress who'd become something close to a friend over the past 8 months. Sarah had perfected the art of keeping secrets, of smiling when her world was crumbling, of pretending everything was fine when nothing, absolutely nothing was. The bell above the entrance chimed, its cheerful jingle a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that had settled over Sarah like a heavy coat. She looked up to see a man pushing through the door, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark brown hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, and eyes that carried the particular exhaustion that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person. Behind him, a small figure emerged from the shadows, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with the same dark hair as her father and eyes that seemed far too old for her face. She clutched a worn purple backpack against her chest like a shield, and Sarah noticed the way she stayed close to the man's side, as if the world beyond his protective radius was too dangerous to navigate alone. Sarah straightened, forcing her professional smile into place, even though it felt like trying to light a match in a hurricane. "Good evening," she called out, grabbing 2 menus from the hostess station. "Just the 2 of you tonight?" The man nodded, his hand finding the little girl's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of practice and patience. "Table for 2, please." Sarah led them to a booth near the window, away from the other customers, and set the menus down with a soft thud. The little girl slid into the red vinyl seat and immediately began arranging the sugar packets in a precise line, her small fingers working with the kind of focused intensity that made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Sarah asked, pulling her order pad from her apron pocket. The pen was running out of ink. She'd been meaning to replace it for weeks, but what was the point now? "Coffee for me," the man said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested he'd been talking all day. "And chocolate milk for Emma, if you have it." The little girl, Emma, looked up at the mention of her name, and Sarah saw something flicker across her face. Not quite a smile, but not the blank expression she'd worn when they walked in. Progress, Sarah thought, remembering another little girl who used to arrange things in perfect lines when the world felt too chaotic to bear. "1 coffee, 1 chocolate milk," Sarah confirmed, scribbling on her pad. "I'll give you a few minutes to look at the menu." She turned to go, but the man's voice stopped her. "Actually, we're not really here to eat. We were driving by, and Emma saw the lights. She's been having a rough day, and sometimes a change of scenery helps. Sarah looked down at Emma, who had finished arranging the sugar packets and moved onto aligning the salt and pepper shakers. There was something about the careful precision of her movements, the way she seemed to exist in her own protective bubble, that tugged at Sarah's heart in a way she wasn't prepared for. "No problem at all," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes we all need a place to just be for a while." The man's eyes met hers, and she saw surprise there, as if kindness was something he wasn't accustomed to receiving. "Thank you. I'm David, by the way, David Martinez." "Sarah," she replied, then added without thinking, "And there's no rush. Stay as long as you need." As she walked away to get their drinks, Sarah felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her again. In 13 minutes, no, 11 now, she would clock out for the last time. Tomorrow she would drive the 400 miles back to Portland. Back to her mother's house. Back to a life that felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. The thought made her stomach churn, but what choice did she have? The coffee machine gurgled to life as she pressed the brew button, and Sarah found herself watching David and Emma through the pass-through window. The man was leaning forward, speaking to his daughter in low, patient tones, while she continued her careful arrangement of the table's contents. There was something achingly familiar about the scene, the way he seemed to be trying to reach across an invisible divide, the way she existed just slightly apart from the world around her. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to find another text from her mother. "Flight confirmation attached. Pick you up at 2:30 tomorrow. Everything will be fine, sweetheart." The words were meant to be comforting, but they felt like a door slamming shut. She poured the coffee into a white ceramic mug, one of the few that wasn't chipped, and reached into the small refrigerator for the chocolate milk. Her hands were steadier than she'd expected them to be, considering that her entire life was about to change in less than 10 minutes. When she returned to the table, she found Emma looking out the window at the parking lot, her small hands pressed flat against the glass. David was watching his daughter with an expression that Sarah recognized all too well, love mixed with helplessness, the particular anguish of wanting to fix something that couldn't be fixed with good intentions alone. "Here we go," Sarah said, setting the drinks down. "One coffee, one chocolate milk." "Thank you," David said, wrapping his hands around the mug as if trying to absorb its warmth. "You don't happen to have any of those little stirring sticks, do you?" "Emma likes to stir in patterns," Sarah finished, already reaching into her apron for the wooden stirrers she always kept handy. "Clockwise or counterclockwise?" David's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Clockwise." "How did you—" "Lucky guess," Sarah said, placing 3 stirrers beside Emma's chocolate milk. She watched as the little girl's face brightened, not quite a smile, but close, and felt something loosen in her chest. Emma picked up one of the stirrers and began making small, precise circles in her chocolate milk, her concentration absolute. Sarah found herself lingering beside the table, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. "She's beautiful," Sarah said quietly, and meant it. There was something luminous about Emma, something that reminded Sarah of the way sunlight looked when it filtered through stained glass, transformed, magical, more beautiful for having been changed. "She is," David agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "She's also autistic, which means the world can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes. Loud noises, crowds, unexpected changes, they all hit her harder than they would most kids." Sarah nodded, understanding more than he knew. "That must be challenging." "It can be," David admitted. "But it's also taught me to see things differently." Emma notices details that most people miss, the way shadows move across a wall, the pattern raindrops make on windows. She experiences the world so intensely, so purely. Sometimes I think she's the one teaching me how to really see. There was something in his voice, pride mixed with exhaustion, love tempered with worry, that made Sarah's throat tighten. She glanced at the clock. 7 minutes. Are you from around here? She asked, not because she needed to know for any professional reason, but because the alternative was walking away, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. About an hour north, David said. We were coming back from a doctor's appointment in the city. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma's been seeing a new therapist, and today was our first session. It didn't go as well as I'd hoped. Sarah saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers gripped the coffee mug a little harder. Sometimes it takes time to find the right fit, she said gently. That's what everyone keeps telling me, David replied, then seemed to catch himself. Sorry, I don't usually dump our problems on strangers. Sometimes strangers are the safest people to talk to, Sarah said, surprising herself with the honesty. We don't have any expectations or history to complicate things. David looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. You sound like you know something about that. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was doing it again, getting too involved, caring too much about people she barely knew. It was the reason she'd lost her last job, the reason her mother was constantly telling her she needed to learn boundaries. But looking at Emma, who was now creating an elaborate pattern of swirls in her chocolate milk, Sarah found she didn't care. I used to work with kids, she said, which was true, even if it left out the complicated parts. Special needs kids, mostly. I know how hard it can be to find someone who really understands. Used to? David asked, picking up on the past tense. Sarah's smile felt brittle around the edges. Career change, she said, which was also true in the most generous interpretation of the phrase. The bell above the door chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see Dolores emerging from the back office, her purse slung over her shoulder and her keys jangling in her hand. 9:58, 2 minutes. Sarah, Dolores called out, her voice carrying the particular pitch that meant she was ready to lock up and go home. You about done over there? Just finishing up, Sarah called back, her heart starting to race. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She looked down at David and Emma, at this small family that had wandered into her life in its final moments at Murphy's, and felt something crack open in her chest. Actually, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, this is my last day. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than she'd expected. David looked up at her, his dark eyes searching her face as if trying to read the story written there. Your last day? He repeated. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She hadn't meant to say, it hadn't meant to burden these strangers with her personal crisis, but something about the quiet intimacy of the moment had stripped away her usual defenses. Sarah. Dolores called again, more insistent this time. I should go, Sarah said quickly, already reaching for her order pad. But thank you for. Wait, David said, and there was something in his voice that made her pause. What happens tomorrow? The question hit her like a physical blow. What did happen tomorrow? She would catch a flight back to Portland, move back into her childhood bedroom, and pretend that the last 2 years of her life hadn't happened. She would smile when her mother introduced her to nice young men at church functions, nod when relatives asked about her plans, and slowly disappear into the life that other people thought she should want. I go home, she said, and the word felt like ash in her mouth. Emma looked up from her chocolate milk, her dark eyes fixing on Sarah's face with startling intensity. For a moment, the little girl seemed to see straight through to the heart of things, the way children sometimes could. Sarah! Dolores's voice had taken on an edge that meant she was officially out of patience. I really have to go, Sarah said, backing away from the table. But it was nice meeting you both. Take care of yourselves. She turned and hurried toward the register, her vision blurring around the edges. Behind her, she could hear David saying something to Emma, his voice low and urgent, but she couldn't make out the words over the rushing in her ears. At the register, she fumbled with her apron strings, her fingers clumsy with emotion. Dolores was already by the door, tapping her foot impatiently. "Finally," Dolores muttered. "I've got a date tonight, and Marcus hates it when I'm late." Sarah nodded absently, hanging her apron on the hook behind the counter. On the hook next to it hung Janet's apron, and beside that, the spare that had belonged to the girl who'd worked here before Sarah, whose name she'd never learned, who'd disappeared. One day without explanation. Soon, someone else would hang their apron there, would learn the rhythm of the coffee machine and the preferences of the regular customers, would become part of Murphy's particular ecosystem of broken dreams and stubborn hope. "You okay, hon?" Dolores asked, her voice softening slightly. "You look a little green around the gills." "Just tired," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day." Dolores nodded, already distracted by her phone. "Well, it's been real, Sarah. Good luck with whatever comes next." And just like that, it was over. Sarah collected her purse. From the small locker in the back, said goodbye to Miguel, who was too busy with the closing routine to do more than grunt in response, and walked toward the front door. She could feel David's eyes on her as she passed their table, but she didn't trust herself to look. The December air hit her like a slap, cold and sharp and brutally honest. She fumbled for her car keys, her hands shaking now that there was no one around to see. Behind her, the lights of Murphy's cast long rectangles of yellow across the parking lot, and she could see David and Emma still sitting in their booth, the little girl's dark head bent over her chocolate milk. Sarah made it halfway to her car before she heard the door chime again, followed by the sound of footsteps on asphalt. She turned to see David jogging toward her, his expression urgent. "Wait," he called out, slightly out of breath. "Please, just wait a minute." Sarah stopped, her hand on her car door handle. "I really can't. Emma wanted me to give you this," David said, holding out a napkin. "She wrote something." With trembling fingers, Sarah took the napkin and unfolded it. In careful, childlike handwriting, someone had written, "Thank you for the stirrers. You are nice, Emma." The words blurred as tears filled Sarah's eyes. She looked up to see Emma standing in the restaurant doorway, her small hand pressed against the glass, watching them with those two old eyes. "She doesn't usually," David began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. "She doesn't connect with people easily. But something about you." Sarah stared down at the napkin, at the careful loops and lines that spelled out more kindness than she'd received in months. "She seems like a special kid." "She is," David said fiercely. "But the world doesn't always see that. People get impatient with her, frustrated when she doesn't respond the way they expect. You were different." Sarah felt something break open in her chest, a grief so sharp and sudden that it took her breath away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" "For having to leave. For not being able to." She gestured helplessly at the napkin, at the restaurant, at the impossible weight of everything she was walking away from. David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the harsh parking lot lights. "Where are you going?" he asked finally. "Portland," Sarah said, the words scraping against her throat. "Back to my mother's. Is that what you want?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah opened her mouth to give the answer she'd been practicing, that it was time to be practical, to stop chasing impossible dreams, to grow up and face reality. But looking at David's earnest face, at Emma's small figure silhouetted in the doorway, she found she couldn't lie. "No," she whispered, "it's not." David nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "What would you do if you could do anything? If money wasn't an issue, if other people's expectations didn't matter, what would you do?" The question hit her like a physical blow. dredging up dreams she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they'd never existed. "I'd work with kids again," she said without thinking. "Kids like Emma. I'd find a way to help them feel understood, valued. I'd create a place where they could be themselves without judgment. What's stopping you?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Reality, money, the fact that my last job ended in spectacular failure. The fact that I'm 28 years old and living paycheck to paycheck. The fact that maybe I'm not as good at this as I thought I was." David was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if she'd said too much, revealed too much of her carefully hidden brokenness. But when she looked up, she saw something unexpected in his eyes, not pity, not judgment, but recognition. "Can I tell you something?" he said finally. Sarah nodded. 6 months ago, I was ready to give up. Emma had been kicked out of 3 different programs. I was drowning in debt from specialist appointments and therapy sessions that didn't help. And I was starting to believe that maybe everyone was right. Maybe I wasn't equipped to give her what she needed. Sarah felt her breath catch. What changed? "Emma did something she'd never done before," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "She drew a picture. Just a simple crayon drawing of the 2 of us holding hands. And at the bottom, in letters, I didn't even know she could write. She spelled out family." Tears spilled over Sarah's cheeks, hot against the cold air. "David, the point is," he continued, "sometimes the universe puts people in our path exactly when we need them most. Tonight, Emma connected with you in a way she rarely connects with anyone. And you saw her. Really saw her, not as a problem to be fixed or a burden to be managed, but as a person worthy of respect and kindness." Sarah stared at him, overwhelmed by the generosity of his words, by the way he seemed to see straight through to the heart of her deepest fears and longings. "I don't know what happened at your last job," David said gently, "and I don't know what's waiting for you in Portland. But I know that in the 20 minutes you spent with my daughter, you gave her something precious, the gift of being understood. That's not something you learn in school or get from a manual. That's something you either have or you don't." The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the parking lot like lost thoughts. In the distance, Sarah could hear the rumble of traffic on the interstate, the endless flow of people going somewhere, anywhere, in search of whatever it was they thought they needed. "My flight leaves at noon tomorrow," she said quietly. David nodded. "That gives you about 14 hours to decide who you want to be when you wake up." Before Sarah could respond, Emma appeared at David's side, having somehow slipped out of the restaurant without either of them noticing. She tugged at her father's jacket, then held up her hands in what Sarah recognized as sign language. David watched his daughter's small fingers move through the air, then looked at Sarah with wonder in his eyes. "She says thank you for seeing." "Her colors." "Her colors?" Sarah asked. "It's something she says about people who understand her," David explained. "She sees the world differently than we do. Synesthesia, the doctors call it. Sounds have colors, emotions have textures. Most people are gray to her, but sometimes. Sarah prompted. Emma stepped forward and placed her small hand in Sarah's, her dark eyes solemn and wise. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Purple and gold," she said clearly, like happy music. Sarah felt her knees buckle, and if David hadn't steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow, she might have collapsed right there in the parking lot. Emma's words echoed in her head. Purple and gold, like happy music, and suddenly, impossibly, she could see it too. The colors of hope, of possibility, of a future she'd been too afraid to imagine. "Emma," David said softly, "can you go wait in the car for a minute? I need to talk to Sarah." The little girl nodded and skipped toward a blue Honda parked near the restaurant entrance, humming something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," played in a minor key. She's never said anything like that to a stranger before, David said, once Emma was out of earshot. Hell, she's never said anything like that to me. Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to process what had just happened. I don't understand. I think you do, David said gently. I think you understand better than you're willing to admit. They stood there in the cold parking lot, two strangers connected by a moment of unexpected grace, while the neon sign of Murphy's Family Restaurant flickered against the December sky. Sarah could feel something shifting inside her, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves after an earthquake. I should go, she said finally, but she made no move toward her car. Yes, David agreed, but he didn't step away. You should. My mother is expecting me. I'm sure she is. I already bought the plane ticket. Plane tickets can be changed. Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something that made her chest tighten with possibility. There was kindness in his eyes, yes, but also understanding, the recognition of one lost soul finding another in the wilderness of ordinary life. What are you suggesting? She asked, though she thought she already knew. I'm suggesting that maybe the universe doesn't make mistakes, David said. Maybe you ended up here tonight for a reason. Maybe Emma saw your colors because you're exactly where you're supposed to be. You don't even know me, Sarah protested weakly. I know enough, David said. I know you treated my daughter with dignity when she was struggling. I know you have experience working with special needs kids. I know you're running from something that's probably not half as scary as the regret you'll feel if you don't at least try to chase your dreams. Sarah felt her resolve wavering like a candle flame in the wind. Even if that were true, which I'm not saying it is, what exactly are you proposing? That I just cancel my flight and stay here indefinitely? I'm proposing that you give yourself a chance, David said simply. Emma needs someone who understands her, and from what I saw tonight, you need to be needed. Maybe we can help each other. Before Sarah could respond, Emma's voice called out from the car. Daddy, the music is getting sad again. David's expression shifted immediately to one of concern. She gets overwhelmed when she's tired, he explained to Sarah. The synesthesia becomes more intense, harder to filter. Without thinking, Sarah started walking toward the car. Emma was pressed against the passenger window, her small hands covering her ears, rocking slightly back and forth. Sarah could see the distress in her posture, the way she seemed to be trying to escape from something only she could perceive. Emma, Sarah called softly, approaching the car slowly. Emma, can you hear me? The little girl looked up, her eyes wide and frightened. Sarah crouched down beside the car window, making herself small and non-threatening. The music is too loud, isn't it? Sarah said gently. All those colors swirling around, making it hard to think. Emma nodded frantically, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering another little girl who used to curl up under her desk when the world became too much, who saw monsters in shadows and heard screaming in silence. When she opened her eyes, she knew what to do. Can you see my hands, Emma? Sarah asked, placing her palms flat against the car window. I want you to breathe with me, okay? In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Can you do that? Emma stared at Sarah's hands, her own breathing ragged and shallow. Slowly, carefully, Sarah began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, she sighed, exaggerating her own breathing so Emma could see the rise and fall of her chest. Hold it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let it out. 1, 2, 3, 4. It took several cycles, but gradually Emma's breathing began to slow. Her rocking stopped, and she placed her own small hands against the window, matching Sarah's position. That's it, Sarah murmured. You're doing so well. The music is getting quieter now, isn't it? The colors are settling down. Emma nodded, her eyes fixed on Sarah's face with absolute trust. Purple and gold, she whispered. Still there. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Still there, she confirmed. Always there when you need them. David appeared beside the car, his face etched with relief and something that looked suspiciously. Like, how did you, he began. Experience, Sarah said simply, standing up slowly so as not to startle Emma. A lot of trial and error, and a few kids who taught me more than any textbook ever could. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Emma's distress faded and her natural curiosity reasserted itself. The little girl began tracing patterns on the fogged window, her finger leaving invisible trails that only she could. See, the job I lost, Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself. It wasn't because I was bad at what I did. It was because I was too good at it. David turned to look at her, eyebrows raised in question. I worked at a residential treatment facility for kids with severe behavioral issues, Sarah continued, the words coming easier now that she'd started. There was this one boy, Marcus, who'd been there for almost 2 years. Everyone had given up on him, except me. I spent extra time with him, developed new strategies, fought for better resources. What happened? Sarah's laugh was bitter. I succeeded. Marcus made incredible progress, enough that he was able to go home to his family. But in the process, I'd bent so many rules, stayed so many extra hours without overtime pay, that the administration decided I was a liability. They let me go the day after Marcus's discharge party. That's insane, David said, his voice tight with anger. That's bureaucracy, Sarah corrected. They said I had boundary issues, that I was too emotionally invested in the outcomes. They weren't wrong, I was. But I couldn't see how to do the job any other way, so you came here. So I ran here, Sarah corrected. Took the first job I could find, in a place where nobody knew my history or my failures. I told myself it was temporary, just until I figured out what to do next. That was 8 months ago. David was quiet for a long moment, processing her story. Finally he said, what if I told you that what they called your greatest weakness might actually be your greatest strength? I'd say you're being kind, but I'd say that Emma doesn't need someone who's going to maintain professional distance, David interrupted. She needs someone who cares enough to fight for her, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Sarah looked through the car window at Emma, who had stopped tracing patterns and was now watching them with those disconcerting dark eyes that seemed to see too much. You're asking me to take a leap of faith, Sarah said quietly. I'm asking you to trust what you felt tonight, David replied. When Emma said you were purple and gold, how did that make you feel? Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the moment when Emma's small hand had slipped into hers, when those whispered words had cut through all her carefully constructed defenses like a blade through silk. Like I was home, she admitted. Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then maybe you were. The words hung between them like a bridge, spanning the gap between what was and what could be. Sarah could feel herself standing at a crossroads, could almost see the two paths stretching out before her, one leading back to the safety of her mother's house, to a life that fit other people's expectations, but left her soul starving. The other leading into the unknown, toward possibility and purpose and the terrifying prospect of hope. Emma tapped on the window, drawing their attention. When they looked at her, she held up both hands, her fingers moving in what Sarah now recognized as sign language. What's she saying? Sarah asked. David watched his daughter's hands for a moment, then smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him all evening. She's asking if you're going to come home with us. The question hit Sarah like a lightning bolt, illuminating corners of her heart she'd forgotten existed. She looked at Emma's expectant face, at David's carefully neutral expression that couldn't quite hide the hope in his eyes, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. I can't just, she began. Yes, you can, David said gently. You can do whatever you choose to do. The question is, what do you choose? Sarah thought about her packed suitcase sitting in her apartment, about the plane ticket in her purse, about her mother's well-meaning disappointment when she called to cancel. She thought about Marcus, about the light in his eyes when he'd realized he was going home, about the satisfaction of knowing she'd made a difference in one small life. But mostly, she thought about Emma's whispered words, purple and gold, like happy music, and the way they'd made her feel like she was finally seen. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said suddenly. "Of course. Why are you doing this? You don't know anything about me beyond what happened tonight. For all you know, I could be completely unqualified, or unstable, or exactly what Emma needs," David finished. "Look, I'll be honest with you. I've been looking for someone to help with Emma for months. I've interviewed nannies, tutors, specialist people with impressive credentials and glowing references. But tonight, I watched my daughter connect with you in a way she's never connected with any of them." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Maybe it's crazy to offer you a job based on 20 minutes of interaction. Maybe I'm being naive or desperate or both. But Emma sees things the rest of us miss, and if she says you're purple and gold, then that's good enough for me." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "What kind of job are we talking about?" "Live-in care, to start," David said. "I travel for work sometimes, and Emma needs consistency. Someone who can be there when she gets overwhelmed, who understands her unique way of processing the world. The salary would be competitive, and you'd have your own space. There's a guest house on the property that's been empty for months." "You're serious?" "Dead serious." Sarah looked at Emma again, at this remarkable little girl who saw the world in colors and music, who had somehow managed to see past all of Sarah's defenses, to the person she'd almost forgotten she could be. "I need to think about it," Sarah said finally. "Of course," David said, though she could see the disappointment flicker across his features. "How much time do you need?" Sarah glanced at her watch. 11:23. Her flight was in 12 hours and 37 minutes. "Until morning," she said. "I'll give you an answer in the morning." David nodded and pulled out his phone. "Can I get your number?" "In case Emma wants to." "Well, in case she wants to say goodbye, either way." Sarah rattled off her digits, watching as David typed them into his contacts. When he was finished, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I hope you stay." Before Sarah could respond, Emma rolled down the car window and leaned out, her dark hair whipping in the wind. "Sarah," she called, her voice clear and strong in the cold night air. "Thank you for helping the sad music stop." And with that, they were gone, the Honda's taillights disappearing into the darkness like fading stars. Sarah stood alone in the empty parking lot, clutching Emma's napkin in one hand and the keys to her uncertain future in the other. Above her, the neon sign of Murphy's Family Restaurant continued its endless cycle on, off, a beacon for travelers and dreamers, and anyone brave enough to believe that, sometimes, the best destinations were the ones you never planned to reach. "Emma's right," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so much time trying to protect her from potential hurt that I almost forgot she needs room to grow and connect with other people." Sarah looked between father and daughter, seeing the deep bond that connected them, but also recognizing the isolation that had been born from David's fierce protectiveness. Emma needed her father's devotion, but she also needed exposure to others who could understand and appreciate her unique gifts. "If I took this job," Sarah said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "what would the arrangement look like? Practically speaking?" David's expression shifted to something that might have been relief, mixed with nervous excitement. "We live about 15 minutes from town, on 5 acres that back up to state forest. The house is larger than we need. It belonged to my grandmother, and she believed in having space for unexpected guests. The guest cottage I mentioned is actually more like a small apartment, completely self-contained with its own kitchen and entrance. What about Emma's current routine? School, therapy, activities? She's homeschooled right now, David admitted. The public school situation didn't work out, and the private options in the area weren't equipped to handle her sensory needs. I've been managing her education myself, but it's not ideal. I'm a good father, but I'm not a trained educator. Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement, and now she bounced on her toes like a small spring that had been wound too tightly. Would you teach me things? She asked Sarah. Real school things, not just the computer. Programs Daddy makes me do. What kinds of things would you want to learn? Sarah asked, charmed by Emma's enthusiasm. Everything, Emma exclaimed. But especially about how colors work in nature, and why music makes different patterns in the air, and how to help other kids who have troubles like me. The last item on Emma's list hit Sarah like a revelation. This remarkable child who had spent most of her young life being viewed as someone who needed help was already thinking about how she could help others. It was a level of empathy and social awareness that contradicted everything Sarah had been taught about autism spectrum disorders. She talks about that a lot, David said quietly. About wanting to help other kids who feel different or misunderstood. I think she recognizes that her way of experiencing the world, while challenging sometimes, also gives her insights that could be valuable to others. Sarah felt something click into place in her mind, a vision of possibility that was both exciting and terrifying. What if, she said slowly, what if we thought about this differently? Not just as a job caring for Emma, but as an opportunity to create something bigger. What do you mean? I mean, what if we used your property, your resources, Emma's insights, and my experience to create a space where kids like Emma could learn and grow together? Not a school exactly, but not a therapy center either. Something new. David stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, consideration, and something that might have been hope. You're talking about starting some kind of program. I'm talking about creating a place where neurodivergent kids can be themselves while learning from each other, Sarah said, her excitement building as the idea took shape. Emma could be our first student and eventually, as she grows, our first teacher. We could develop curriculum that honors different learning styles, create environments that support sensory needs, build a community where families don't have to choose between acceptance and education. Emma had stopped bouncing and was now staring at Sarah with an intensity that was almost unsettling. You want to make a school for kids like me? I want to make a place where kids like you can flourish, Sarah corrected. Where your unique abilities are seen as gifts rather than problems to be managed. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Sarah could see David processing the implications of what she was suggesting. The logistical challenges, the financial requirements, the regulatory hurdles that would need to be navigated. But she could also see something else in his expression, recognition that this idea aligned perfectly with everything he'd been trying to give Emma. It would be complicated, he said finally. The best things usually are. It would require significant investment, both financial and emotional. I'm aware of that. It would mean taking enormous risks with no guarantee of success. Sarah smiled, feeling more certain than she had about anything in months. Welcome to my life story. Emma stepped forward and took Sarah's hand, her small fingers warm and surprisingly strong. I think this is what the colors were trying to tell me, she said solemnly. When I first saw you, your purple and gold were all mixed up with worry colors. But now they're getting clearer and brighter, like you're remembering who you really are. The simple truth of Emma's observation hit Sarah like a gentle earthquake, shifting everything into a new configuration that felt both foreign and familiar. She was remembering who she really was, not the cautious, defeated woman who'd spent 8 months hiding in Murphy's family restaurant, but the passionate advocate who'd fought for Marcus and dozens of other children who needed someone to see their potential rather than their limitations. "Would you really want to do this?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with barely contained hope. "Build something from scratch with no roadmap and no guarantees?" Sarah looked around the peaceful park, at the ducks, still paddling hopefully near the shore, at the morning mist rising from the water like dreams taking flight. She thought about her packed suitcase sitting in her apartment, about the plane ticket that would expire unused, about the safe life she was choosing to abandon in favor of something infinitely more challenging and potentially more rewarding. "Yes," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I really would." Emma let out a squeal of delight that sent the ducks scrambling for deeper water, and even David's carefully controlled expression cracked into a grin that transformed his entire face. For a moment, the three of them stood there grinning at each other like conspirators who just agreed to attempt something impossible. "We should probably discuss practical matters," David said eventually, though his voice still carried traces of wonder. "Salary, living arrangements, legal considerations." "We should," Sarah agreed. "But first, I think I need to see where we'd be doing this impossible thing." The drive to David's property took them through countryside that Sarah had never bothered to explore during her months of self-imposed isolation. Rolling hills gave way to dense forest, and the road wound through tunnels of trees that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. Emma kept up a steady stream of commentary from the back seat, pointing out every interesting cloud formation and explaining the musical qualities of different engine sounds. "That truck sounds like a sad tuba," she announced as they passed a rumbling semi. "But our car sounds like happy violins having a conversation." Sarah found herself charmed by Emma's unique perspective, by the way she transformed ordinary experiences into something magical through the lens of her synesthetic perception. It occurred to her that this child's way of seeing the world wasn't a deficit that needed to be corrected, but a gift that needed to be nurtured and shared. When they turned into a long gravel driveway, Sarah felt her breath catch. The property was even more beautiful than David had described, a rambling Victorian farmhouse set among towering oak trees, with outbuildings that included a red barn, a greenhouse, and what appeared to be a small cottage nestled among the trees. Gardens that had been carefully tended showed the evidence of someone who understood that beauty and functionality could coexist. "My grandmother was quite the gardener," David said, noticing Sarah's admiration. "She believed that children needed space to explore and discover, so she designed everything with that in mind." Emma was out of the car before it had fully stopped, running toward a massive oak tree that dominated the front yard. "This is my thinking tree," she called to Sarah. "It's where I go when I need to sort out my colors." Sarah followed more slowly, taking in the details that spoke of a life lived with intention and care. Wind chimes hung from the porch eaves, their gentle music creating a soundtrack that felt both peaceful and welcoming. Garden paths wound through beds of late-blooming flowers, and bird feeders strategically placed throughout the yard ensured a constant stream of avian visitors. "It's incredible," Sarah said, meaning it completely. "It's also a lot of work," David said with a rueful smile. "Grandmother had a full-time gardener and a housekeeper. I've been doing my best to maintain it, but some areas have gotten away from me." Sarah could see what he meant. There were signs of benign neglect in overgrown flower beds and a greenhouse that clearly needed attention. But rather than detracting from the property's beauty, these imperfections made it feel more real, more human, more like a place where actual life was lived rather than a museum to someone else's perfection. "Can I see the cottage?" Sarah asked. David led her along a winding path that meandered through a small orchard, pointing out fruit trees that his grandmother had planted decades ago. The cottage, when they reached it, was like something from a fairy tale: stone walls covered with ivy, mullioned windows that caught the morning light, and a red door that looked like it was waiting for someone to come home. Inside, the space was compact but thoughtfully designed, with a living area that flowed into a small kitchen, a bedroom tucked under the eaves, and a bathroom that managed to feel spacious despite its modest size. What struck Sarah most was the sense of peace that permeated the space, as if the cottage had been designed specifically for contemplation and renewal. The previous tenant was a writer, David explained, noting Sarah's appreciation. She lived here for 3 years while working on a novel about immigrant families. Said the quiet helped her think. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at a view that included the main house, the gardens, and beyond them, the forest that stretched to the horizon. She could imagine waking up here every morning, could picture herself grading papers at the small kitchen table or planning lessons while listening to the wind in the trees. Emma wants to show you her room, David said. If you're ready to see the main house. Emma's bedroom was a testament to organized chaos, with every surface covered in carefully arranged collections, rocks sorted by color and texture, books organized according to some system that defied alphabetical logic, art supplies grouped in ways that probably made perfect sense to someone who experienced the world's synesthetic ally. What struck Sarah most was how the room felt like a three-dimensional representation of a brilliant, complex mind. I organize everything by how it feels, Emma explained, noting Sarah's interest in the book arrangement. Happy books go with other happy books, even if they're about different things. Sad books need to be separate, but not too far away, because sometimes you need a sad book to help you understand why you're feeling funny inside. The logic was unassailable, and Sarah found herself nodding as if this was the most natural way to organize a library. That makes perfect sense, she said. I bet you always know exactly where to find what you need. Daddy doesn't understand it, Emma said with the tolerant affection of someone who'd grown accustomed to being misunderstood. He keeps trying to put everything in alphabet order, but that makes the books argue with each other. David looked sheepish. I've learned to leave her organizing systems alone, even when they look chaotic to me. Usually there's a logic I just can't see. The tour continued through the rest of the house, a spacious kitchen with windows overlooking the gardens, a living room with built-in bookshelves and a fireplace that actually worked, a dining room that could easily seat 12 people, and several other bedrooms that had been serving as storage areas. It was the kind of house that had been designed for a large family, and Sarah could easily envision it filled with children's laughter and the organized chaos of learning. The barn would need significant renovation to be usable as classroom space, David said as they walked through the large structure. But the bones are good, and there's enough room for multiple learning areas. Sarah stood in the center of the barn, looking up at the massive wooden beams and imagining the possibilities. She could see reading nooks tucked into corners, science labs with plenty of ventilation, art studios with north-facing windows, and quiet spaces where overstimulated children could retreat when the world became too much. It would cost a fortune to renovate this, she said practically. I have a fortune, David replied matter-of-factly. Grandmother left me quite well provided for, and I've been looking for a meaningful way to use her resources. This feels like exactly what she would have wanted. Emma had been exploring the hayloft and now called down from above. Sarah, come see this. It's perfect for the music room. Sarah climbed the ladder to find Emma standing in a space flooded with natural light, her arms outstretched as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Listen, Emma commanded, and Sarah did, hearing the way sound move through the space, the natural acoustics created by the high ceiling and wooden walls. She's right, Sarah said, wonder in her voice. This would be an incredible music room. See? Emma said with satisfaction. I told you the barn was talking to me about its possibilities. As they walked back toward the house, Sarah felt a growing sense of rightness about this decision. It wasn't just about taking a job or helping one remarkable child. It was about creating something that could touch dozens of lives, could offer hope to families who'd been told their children would never quite fit into the world's predetermined spaces. I have one more question, Sarah said as they settled on the front porch with glasses of lemonade that David had produced from somewhere. Just one? David asked with a smile. What happens if this doesn't work? What happens if I turn out to be as much of a disaster here as at my last job? David was quiet for a moment, watching Emma chase butterflies in the front garden with the single-minded determination that seemed to characterize everything she did. I don't think you were a disaster, he said finally. I think you were exactly what Marcus needed, even if the system couldn't handle your methods. But to answer your question, if this doesn't work, then we'll figure out something else. That's what people do when they care about each other. Emma appeared at Sarah's elbow, slightly out of breath from her butterfly expedition. Can I tell you a secret? She asked. Sarah nodded. I dreamed about you before we met, Emma said solemnly. In my dream, you were teaching a whole bunch of kids who had different kinds of brains, and everyone was happy because they didn't have to pretend to be someone else. When I woke up, I told Daddy that someone with purple and gold colors was going to come help us, but he thought I was just making up stories. I did not think you were making up stories, David protested. I thought you were engaging in wishful thinking. What's the difference? Emma asked with the devastating logic that children sometimes employ. There isn't one, Sarah said softly, looking at this remarkable child who somehow managed to see possibilities that adults had trained themselves to dismiss as impossible. The sun was getting higher now, and Sarah realized she'd been at the property for over 2 hours without once thinking about the life she was supposed to be returning to. Her mother would be wondering why she hadn't called with updates about her flight. Her few belongings would need to be moved from her apartment. There were 1,000 practical details that would need to be addressed. But sitting on this porch, watching Emma chase butterflies while David described his vision for transforming the property into a sanctuary for neurodivergent children, Sarah felt more at home than she had in years. This wasn't just a job opportunity, it was a chance to build something meaningful from scratch, to create the kind of place she'd always dreamed of working in, but had never believed could actually exist. I need to go back to town and handle some logistics, she said finally. Cancel my flight, extend my lease until I can figure out what to do with my stuff. Call my mother and try to explain why I'm completely changing my life based on a chance encounter in a diner. Does that mean what I think it means? David asked, hope evident in his voice. Sarah looked at Emma, who had stopped chasing butterflies and was now watching the adults with an expression of breathless anticipation. It means, Sarah said, her voice steady with newfound certainty, that if you're serious about this crazy plan, then so am I. Emma let out a whoop of joy that sent every bird in the immediate vicinity into flight, and David's smile was bright enough to power the entire property. For a moment, the three of them sat there grinning at each other, 3 people who'd found each other against all odds, and were about to embark on an adventure that was equal parts terrifying and wonderful. There's just one more thing, Sarah said. What's that? David asked. I want to do this right. Not just the education part, but the business part, the legal part, all of it. If we're going to build something that lasts, something that can really help families, then we need to be smart about how we do it. Agreed, David said. I've already spoken with a lawyer about the zoning requirements and licensing procedures. It's complicated, but not impossible. And I want Emma to be involved in every decision that affects her, Sarah continued. This is her life too, and she should have a voice in how it's shaped. Emma beamed at this declaration. Can I help? Design the classrooms and choose the colors for the walls? And decide what kinds of snacks we serve? All of that and more, Sarah promised. As she drove back toward town, Sarah felt a lightness in her chest that she hadn't experienced in months. Behind her, she could see David and Emma in her rearview mirror, standing in their driveway and waving goodbye with the enthusiasm of people who were already planning for her return. Her phone rang just as she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, and she wasn't surprised to see her mother's number on the display. "Sarah," Patricia Chun said without preamble, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want you to know that I support your decision." The words were so unexpected that Sarah had to pull over to process them properly. "You do?" "I do. Not because I understand it, and not because I'm not worried about you making a mistake, but because you sounded more like yourself this morning than you have in months. If this job, this family, this crazy plan of yours can give you back the passion you've been missing, then maybe it's worth the risk." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you, Mom. That means more to me than you know. Just promise me you'll be careful, and that you'll call me every week, whether you have good news or bad news. I promise. And Sarah, yes? If this doesn't work out, if things get difficult or complicated or overwhelming, you always have a home here. No questions asked. No, I told you so. Just unconditional love and support. I love you too, Mom." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her car and looked up at the second-floor window that had been her refuge for 8 months. Tomorrow that window would belong to someone else, another person starting over. Another story of resilience and hope, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the destination was unclear. But tonight, it was still hers. Tonight, she would pack her few belongings and prepare for a morning that would bring not an ending, but a beginning. A beginning that included a little girl who saw the world in colors and music, a devoted father who was willing to risk everything for his daughter's happiness, and the kind of meaningful work that had always felt more like calling than career. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sarah found herself humming something under her breath, a melody she didn't recognize, but that felt familiar nonetheless. Like a song she'd always known but had simply forgotten how to sing. It wasn't until she reached her door that she realized what it was, the sound of possibility itself, purple and gold like happy music, rising in her chest like a promise of everything that was yet to come. Weight of morning, Sarah's apartment felt smaller than usual in the pre-dawn darkness, the walls seeming to press inward as she sat on the edge of her unmade bed, staring at the suitcase that had been packed for 3 days. Outside, the first hints of gray were creeping across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rumble of delivery trucks beginning their morning routes. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed an accusatory red. 5:47 a.m. She hadn't slept. How could she, with Emma's words echoing in her head like a song she couldn't shake? Purple and gold, like happy music. The phrase had taken root in her mind, growing stronger with each passing hour until it felt less like a memory and more like a prophecy. The coffee maker gurgled to life in the kitchenette, filling the studio apartment with the rich aroma that had become her morning ritual over the past 8 months. Sarah wrapped her hands around the steaming mug, seeking warmth that seemed to elude her despite the apartment's stuffy heat. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Kowalski's television already blaring the morning news, a constant stream of disasters and disappointments that served as the soundtrack to most people's breakfast routines. Her phone sat silent on the small dining table, David's number stored in her contacts like a loaded gun. She'd typed out a dozen text messages over the course of the sleepless night, each one deleted before she could find the courage to press send. What was she supposed to say? "Thank you for the offer, but I'm not brave enough to change my life. Sorry for giving your daughter false hope. I'm exactly the kind of person who runs away when things get complicated." The truth was more nuanced and infinitely more painful. Sarah wanted to stay wanted it with a ferocity that surprised her, but wanting something and believing you deserved it were two entirely different things. She'd learned that lesson the hard way at Riverside Treatment Center, where her dedication had been reframed as recklessness, her compassion labeled as unprofessional attachment. Dr. Patricia Henley, the facility director, had called her into the sterile conference room on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Sarah remembered the way the fluorescent lights had hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare that made the world look like an overexposed photograph. "Sarah, we need to discuss your approach with the residents," Dr. Henley had said, her voice carrying the particular tone that people used when they were about to deliver news that would fundamentally alter your understanding of yourself. "While your dedication is admirable, we've noticed some concerning patterns in your interactions." The words that followed had been carefully chosen, professionally delivered, and devastating in their implications. Boundary violations, emotional over-involvement, failure to maintain therapeutic distance. Each phrase had landed like a physical blow, redefining 2 years of what Sarah had believed was meaningful work into something that sounded vaguely pathological. "We understand that you care deeply about these children," Dr. Henley had continued, her expression a careful mask of administrative sympathy. "But caring isn't enough if it compromises the structured environment these residents need to heal." Sarah had tried to defend herself, to explain that Marcus's breakthrough had been the result of consistent, individualized attention rather than the cookie-cutter approach the facility typically employed. She'd pointed to the progress reports, the behavioral improvements, the way Marcus had started sleeping through the night for the first time in his 2-year residency. "Marcus's progress is commendable," Dr. Henley had acknowledged. "But at what cost? You've been working unauthorized overtime, bringing in personal materials without approval, and developing what can only be described as a maternal attachment to a child who isn't yours to save." The phrase had echoed in Sarah's mind for months afterward. A child who isn't yours to save. As if caring about someone's well-being was somehow a form of theft, as if the boundaries that were supposed to protect everyone involved had become walls that kept meaningful connection at bay. Now, sitting in her cramped apartment with David's offer hanging in the balance, Sarah wondered if Dr. Henley had been right. Maybe she was too emotionally invested, too willing to blur the lines between professional responsibility and personal attachment. Maybe the smart thing, the safe thing, was to get on that plane and return to a life that wouldn't ask her to risk her heart again. Her phone buzzed, and Sarah's pulse jumped before she realized it was just her mother, sending the daily barrage of messages that had become routine since Sarah had agreed to come home. "Good morning, sweetheart. I've been up since 5 getting your room ready. Mrs. Peterson from next door is so excited to meet you. Her nephew works at the hospital and might be able to help you find something in healthcare administration. Much more stable than what you've been doing. See you this afternoon, love, Mom." Sarah stared at the message, trying to summon enthusiasm for a future that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. Healthcare administration. Stable. The words should have been comforting, but instead they felt like a slow death by bureaucracy. She thought about her mother's well-meaning interference, the way Patricia Chun had spent the last 8 months, orchestrating Sarah's return to what she considered a proper life. Job interviews with family friends, introductions to suitable young men, a careful reconstruction of the daughter she'd always wanted Sarah to be. It wasn't malicious. Her mother genuinely believed that stability and convention were the keys to happiness. But Sarah had learned that happiness was more complicated than a steady paycheck and a socially acceptable boyfriend. The coffee had gone cold in her hands, but Sarah barely noticed. She was thinking about Emma's face when she'd placed the stirring sticks beside her chocolate milk. The way the little girl's expression had shifted from wariness to something approaching wonder. She was thinking about David's quiet desperation, the way he'd spoken about his daughter with such fierce love and protective determination. She was thinking about the way it had felt to be needed again, to use skills that had been gathering dust in the corners of her heart. A knock at the door broke through her reverie, and Sarah glanced at the clock in confusion. 6:30 in the morning was far too early for visitors, and her neighbors weren't the type to borrow sugar or make small talk. She padded to the door in her socks, peering through the peephole to see a delivery driver holding a small package. Sarah Chun? The driver asked when she opened the door, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Sarah nodded, accepting the package with growing curiosity. It wasn't large, about the size of a paperback book, and bore no return address. Beyond a local postal code. She thanked the driver and closed the door, turning the package over in her hands as if it might reveal its secrets through touch alone. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and accompanied by a handwritten note, was a small wooden box decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. Sarah lifted it carefully, noting the smooth weight of it in her palms, the way the carved design seemed to flow like water across the surface. The note was written in David's careful handwriting. Emma made this in art therapy last month. She said it was for someone who would understand her colors, but we never knew who that was until last night. She wants you to have it, regardless of what you decide. Inside, you'll find something she calls pieces of happy music. I hope they help you find your way. David and Emma. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the small latch, revealing a collection of objects that might have seemed random to anyone else, but told a story she was only beginning to understand. There was a smooth river stone painted in swirls of purple and gold, a small wooden star that had been sanded to silk smoothness, a pressed flower that still held traces of its original lavender color, and a folded piece of paper covered in Emma's careful handwriting. Sarah unfolded the paper, her heart clenching as she read the words, "For Sarah who sees me right. Thank you for the stirring sticks and the breathing and the way you made the loud music quiet. You have the most beautiful colors I ever saw. Please don't go away. Love, Emma." Below the words was a drawing stick, figures holding hands under a rainbow that contained more colors than Sarah could count, with musical notes scattered across the sky like stars. In the corner, Emma had written "Our family" in letters that grew progressively smaller, as if she'd run out of space but refused to run out of hope. Sarah sank onto her couch, clutching the box and its contents as tears streamed down her cheeks. This wasn't just a gift, it was an invitation, a plea, a child's pure faith that the world could be different if the right people chose to make it so. Emma had given her pieces of happy music, fragments of joy that she'd somehow collected and saved for someone she'd never met, but had always been waiting for. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. On one side was safety, her mother's house, a predictable future, the comfort of living within expectations that never changed. On the other side was the unknown, a job with no guarantees, a family that wasn't hers, the terrifying prospect of caring deeply enough to be hurt again. But as she held Emma's treasures in her hands, Sarah realized that the choice had already been made. Sometime between the moment Emma had whispered "purple and gold" and now, her heart had decided what her mind was still struggling to accept. She couldn't walk away from this child who saw the world in music and colors, who had somehow recognized something in Sarah that she'd almost forgotten existed herself. Her phone was in her hand before she consciously decided to pick it up, David's number glowing on the screen like a beacon. It was still early, not even 7 a.m., but something told her he would be awake, waiting, hoping. The phone rang twice before his voice filled the small apartment, rough with sleep but alert. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," she said. Without preamble, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Anything. When you offered me this job last night, were you thinking with your head or your heart?" David was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear the soft sounds of morning in. The background coffee brewing, maybe, or the whisper of curtains being drawn back. "Both," he said finally. "My head tells me that Emma needs someone who understands her, and you clearly do. My heart tells me that sometimes the universe puts people exactly where they need to be, even when they don't know they're looking for each other." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the last of her resistance crumble like a wall made of sand. "Can I meet Emma again? Before I make my final decision?" "She's been awake since 5, David said. and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice. "She's been sitting by the window, watching for cars. I think she's been hoping you'd call. I got her package, the wooden box. She spent 2 hours last night deciding what to put in it," David said softly. "She kept saying she needed to find the right pieces of music for someone who was sad, but didn't know why." The description hit Sarah like a revelation. Emma had seen through her carefully constructed facade to the truth underneath, that she was indeed sad, had been sad for months without fully understanding why. The little girl had somehow recognized a kindred spirit, someone who was struggling to find her place in a world that often seemed designed for people who fit more easily into its predetermined spaces. "Where would you like to meet?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "There's a park about 10 minutes from Murphy's Riverside Park, near the duck pond. Emma loves feeding the ducks, and it's usually quiet in the mornings. Would that work?" Sarah looked at her suitcase, at the plane ticket on her kitchen table, at the life she'd been prepared to return to just hours ago. "Yes," she said, "that works. Give me an hour?" "We'll be there," David said, and then, more quietly, "Sarah?" "Yes? Thank you for considering this. For not just disappearing." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the growing daylight, holding Emma's box like a talisman. Around her, the apartment that had been her refuge for 8 months suddenly felt like a chrysalis she'd outgrown, necessary for a time, but no longer capable of containing who she was becoming. She thought about calling her mother, about the disappointed silence that would follow her explanation, about the careful plans that would have to be unmade. Patricia Chun had never understood her daughter's need to help broken things, had always believed that Sarah's compassion was a character flaw rather than a strength. The conversation would be difficult, potentially relationship-altering, but Sarah found she was less afraid of her mother's disappointment than she was of her own. Moving with sudden purpose, Sarah opened her laptop and navigated to the airline's website. The flight change fee would eat into her meager savings, but the option to reschedule rather than cancel outright felt like a safety net she wasn't quite ready to abandon. If things didn't work out with David and Emma, she could still retreat to Portland and her mother's carefully orchestrated life plan. But as she clicked through the website's options, Sarah realized she was already thinking about the job differently. This wasn't a desperate escape from her current circumstances. It was a conscious choice to step into a life that might actually fit. For the first time in months, she felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. The drive to Riverside Park gave Sarah time to think, to observe the town she'd been living in without really seeing for the past 8 months. In daylight, stripped of the harsh fluorescent glow of Murphy's, the place revealed itself to be almost charming. Victorian houses lined tree-shaded streets, their front porches decorated with the kind of detail that spoke of pride and permanence. Children's bicycles leaned against front steps, and garden plots showed the careful attention of people who planned to stay long enough to see their flowers bloom. It was the kind of place Sarah had always imagined herself living someday, small enough to know your neighbors, large enough to have actual opportunities, close enough to a city to feel connected to the wider world, but far enough away to maintain its own identity. She'd been so focused on leaving that she'd never considered the possibility of staying, of putting down roots in soil that might actually nurture growth. Riverside Park stretched along the banks of a modest creek that probably flooded in spring and nearly disappeared in late summer. The morning mist was still rising from the water, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that made the whole scene look like something from a children's book. Sarah parked near the small playground and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her normally neat ponytail had developed a mind of its own. She spotted David and Emma before they saw her, sitting on a bench near the duck pond with a paper bag that probably contained breadcrumbs. Emma was wearing a bright yellow jacket that made her look like a small sun against the muted colors of the autumn landscape, and she was leaning against her father's side with the unconscious trust that children reserve for the people who make them feel safest in the world. As Sarah approached, Emma looked up and broke into the kind of radiant smile that could power small cities. She jumped down from the bench and ran towards Sarah with her arms outstretched, stopping just short of actual contact, but bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. "You came," Emma announced, as if Sarah's presence was the most wonderful surprise imaginable. "Daddy said you might, but I was worried the sad music would be too loud for you to hear us calling." The phrase was so uniquely Emma that Sarah felt her heart contract with affection. "The music is much quieter today," she said, crouching down to Emma's eye level. "I think your box helped. The pieces of happy music are very powerful." Emma's face lit up with pride. "I knew they would work. Daddy said I was being silly, but I could see your colors getting brighter when I picked each piece. The stone is for when you need to feel solid, and the star is for when you need to remember that you're special, and the flower is for when you need to remember that beautiful things can last even when they look fragile." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of thought this 7-year-old had put into her gift. "And what about the paper? What's that one for?" "That one's for when you forget that you belong somewhere," Emma said solemnly. "Sometimes people get lost and think they have to be by themselves forever, but that's not true. Everyone belongs somewhere, and I think you belong with us." David cleared his throat softly, and Sarah looked up to see him watching the interaction with an expression that was equal parts wonder and relief. "She's been talking about you all night," he said. "I think she's more invested in this outcome than either of us realized." Sarah stood slowly, her mind reeling with the implications of Emma's words. This child, who supposedly had difficulty connecting with others, had somehow formed an attachment so strong that she'd spent hours crafting the perfect gift for someone she'd met only once. It was both humbling and terrifying, the weight of being seen so clearly by someone so young and vulnerable. "Can I ask you something, Emma?" Sarah said, settling onto the bench beside David while Emma busied herself with arranging breadcrumbs in precise patterns for the ducks. "Uh-huh," Emma replied without looking up from her work. "When you say you see people's colors, what does that mean exactly?" Emma paused in her breadcrumb arrangement, tilting her head to one side as if listening to music only she could hear. "Most people are gray," she said finally. "Not because they're bad, but because they're thinking about so many things at once that all their colors get mixed up and muddy. But sometimes someone has colors that stay clear and bright, and those are the people who understand things." "What kinds of things?" "Important things. Like how it feels when the world is too loud, or why some people need quiet spaces, or how to help someone when they're scared." Emma looked up at Sarah with those disconcerting dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "You understand those things. That's why your colors are so pretty." Sarah glanced at David, who was watching his daughter with the kind of amazed pride that parents reserve for moments when their children reveal depths they hadn't known existed. "She's been like this since she was very small," he said quietly. "The doctors say it's synesthesia. Her brain processes sensory information differently, so she experiences sounds as colors, emotions as textures. But I think it's more than that. I think she sees things about people that the rest of us miss." "Like what?" "Like the fact that you're not really sad," Emma interjected, apparently having been listening to their conversation while simultaneously managing to attract every duck in the immediate vicinity. "You're lonely. There's a difference. Sad is when something bad happens and it hurts. Lonely is when you have love to give but nowhere to put it." The observation was so accurate and delivered so matter-of-factly that Sarah felt like she'd been struck by lightning. Emma had managed to articulate something Sarah herself hadn't been able to name, the hollow ache that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with having a heart full of care with no one to receive it. "How do you know so much about feelings?" Sarah asked, her voice slightly unsteady. Emma shrugged, as if the question was puzzling to her. I just do. The same way you know how to help people breathe when they're scared. Some things you don't have to learn, you just remember them from before you were born. David reached over and smoothed his daughter's hair with a gesture so tender it made Sarah's chest ache. She says things like that sometimes. The therapists call it advanced emotional intelligence, but honestly, I think she's just wise in ways that don't fit into their categories. It must be challenging, Sarah said. Raising a child who sees the world so differently. It is, David admitted. But it's also incredible. Emma has taught me to pay attention to things I never would have noticed otherwise. The way light changes throughout the day, the different sounds that silence can make, the fact that kindness has a color that most people can't see but everyone can feel. As if summoned by his words, a small flock of ducks paddled closer to shore, drawn by Emma's careful distribution of breadcrumbs. She giggled as they began to squabble over the offerings, her delight so pure and infectious that Sarah found herself smiling despite the weight of the decision she was trying to make. Can I tell you why I really left my last job? Sarah asked, suddenly the words escaping before she could reconsider them. David nodded, his attention fully focused on her in a way that felt both intimidating and comforting. There was this boy, Marcus. He'd been at the facility for almost 2 years, and everyone had basically written him off as unreachable. Severe trauma, behavioral issues, the kind of case that makes administrators nervous about liability and insurance costs. Sarah paused, watching Emma's interaction with the ducks while she gathered her thoughts. Marcus reminded me of myself at that age. Not the trauma part, but the way he seemed to exist slightly apart from everyone else, like he was watching the world through glass. I started spending extra time with him, developing strategies that weren't in any manual, trying things that probably violated a dozen policies. What kinds of things? Music therapy using songs he chose instead of the approved playlist. Art projects that let him express his anger in safe ways. Sensory breaks in a quiet room I'd set up without official permission. Nothing dangerous or inappropriate, just individualized care that went beyond the standard protocol. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the part of the story that still hurt to tell. It worked. Marcus started sleeping through the night, participating in group activities, even talking about his feelings. After 18 months of believing he'd never be able to function outside an institutional setting, he was ready to go home. That sounds like a success story. It was, but success came at a cost. I'd been working unpaid overtime, using my own money to buy supplies, bending rules that were supposedly there to protect everyone involved. When the administration realized how much I'd deviated from standard procedures, they panicked. Emma had finished feeding the ducks and was now collecting interesting stones from the water's edge, arranging them in patterns that probably meant something in her unique visual language. Sarah watched her work, noting the careful attention to detail. The way she seemed to be constructing meaning from elements that others might dismiss as random. They said I had boundary issues, Sarah continued. That I was too emotionally invested in outcomes that weren't mine to control. They weren't wrong, I was invested. But I couldn't see how to do the job any other way. So they fired you for caring too much. They fired me for caring incorrectly, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. Caring within established parameters is professional. Caring enough to question those parameters is dangerous. David was quiet for a long moment, processing her story. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than judgmental. What if I told you that Emma needs someone who cares incorrectly? Someone who's willing to question parameters and bend rules and fight for what she needs rather than what's convenient. I'd say that sounds both wonderful and terrifying. Most worthwhile things are. Emma appeared at Sarah's side, her small hands cupped around something precious. Look, she said, opening her palms to reveal a perfectly round stone that had been worn smooth by countless seasons of water and weather. "The river made this just for you." Sarah accepted the stone with the solemnity the moment seemed to require. It was warm from Emma's hands and fit perfectly in her palm, as if it had indeed been shaped specifically for her fingers to hold. "Thank you," Sarah said. "It's beautiful." "It's brave," Emma corrected. "The river had to be patient for a very long time to make it so smooth. Sometimes being brave means letting the water wash over you until you're strong enough to be exactly who you're supposed to be." The metaphor was so apt and delivered with such innocent wisdom that Sarah felt another piece of her resistance crumble away. This child, who saw the world in colors and music, had somehow understood that Sarah was in the process of being shaped by forces beyond her control, that the difficult experiences of the past months had been preparing her for this moment, this choice, this leap of faith into an unknown but potentially transformative future. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "if I came to live with you and your daddy, what would that look like? What would you want me to do?" Emma's face brightened as if someone had switched on a light inside her. "You could help me with the colors when they get too loud," she said eagerly. "And you could teach me more breathing patterns for when the music gets scary. And maybe you could help Daddy understand why I need to arrange things in special ways." "What kinds of special ways?" "Like how my books have to be organized by the color of their feelings, not their alphabet letters. And how I can't eat foods that make arguing sounds when they touch each other on my plate. And how sometimes I need to rock back and forth because it helps my brain find its rhythm again." Sarah glanced at David, noting the way his expression had shifted to something that might have been relief. It occurred to her that he'd been navigating Emma's unique needs largely on his own, trying to understand a perspective that was fundamentally different from his own while simultaneously protecting her from a world that wasn't always patient with difference. "Those all sound like very reasonable needs," Sarah said to Emma. "Everyone's brain works differently, and there's nothing wrong with knowing what helps yours work best." "See?" Emma said, turning to her father with triumph in her voice. "I told you she would understand." David smiled, but Sarah could see the exhaustion behind it, the weariness of someone who'd been fighting battles on multiple fronts for longer than should be humanly sustainable. "How long have you been doing this alone?" she asked gently. "Since Emma's mother left when she was 3, David said, his voice carefully neutral. "Rachel couldn't handle the diagnosis. She kept thinking that if she tried hard enough, she could make Emma normal. And when that didn't work, she decided it was better for everyone if she stepped away." The casual way he delivered this devastating information told Sarah everything she needed to know about how much pain he'd learned to carry without complaint. Emma, who was now building an elaborate castle out of the stones she'd collected, seemed oblivious to the conversation, but Sarah suspected the little girl understood more than she let on. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was. But it also clarified things. Emma doesn't need to be fixed or changed or made to fit into someone else's idea of who she should be. She needs to be understood and supported and celebrated for exactly who she is. The conviction in his voice was absolute, and Sarah felt something settle into place in her chest, a recognition that this man had learned the same hard lesson she'd learned at Riverside, that love sometimes meant standing against conventional wisdom and fighting for what was right rather than what was easy. "Can I ask you something now?" David said. Sarah nodded. "What are you most afraid of? About taking this job, I mean." The question hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront fears she'd been trying to keep buried. "I'm afraid of caring too much again," she said honestly. "I'm afraid of crossing boundaries that I don't even know exist. I'm afraid of getting attached to Emma and then failing her the way I apparently failed Marcus." "You didn't fail Marcus," David said firmly. "You gave him what he needed to heal, even when it cost you everything. That's not failure, that's heroism. The administrators didn't see it that way. The administrators were idiots. Emma looked up from her stone castle, apparently having been listening despite her apparent absorption in her project. "Daddy said a bad word," she announced with the kind of scandalized delight that children reserve for adult rule-breaking. "Yes, I did," David admitted, not looking particularly repentant. "Sometimes grown-ups say bad words when they're angry about people being unfair to other people they care about." "Are you angry about people being unfair to Sarah?" "Yes, I am." Emma considered this for a moment, then nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable response. "Me too. Sarah has very bright colors, and people should be nice to people with bright colors." The simple loyalty in her voice made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. This child, who supposedly had difficulty forming attachments, had somehow claimed Sarah as belonging to her after a single evening's acquaintance. It was both humbling and overwhelming, the weight of being chosen by someone so pure in their affections. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "what if I came to live with you and your daddy, but then something happened and I had to leave? Would that make you sad?" Emma tilted her head to one side, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Everyone leaves sometimes," she said finally. "Mommy left, and my old teachers left, and Mrs. Henderson, who used to watch me after school, left when she got too old to remember my name. But some people leave because they have to, and some people leave because they want to, and some people don't really leave at all. They just go away for a while. Which kind of leaving would I be doing?" "I don't know yet," Emma said honestly. "But I think if you came to live with us, you might be the kind of person who stays. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Because we're your family. Now and family stick together, even when things get hard." The word family hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. Sarah looked at this remarkable child who saw the world in colors and music, at this devoted father who'd given up everything to protect his daughter's unique way of being, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what home could mean. "I need to make a phone call," Sarah said suddenly, pulling her cell phone from her pocket. "Would you excuse me for just a minute?" David nodded, and Sarah walked far enough away to have privacy while still keeping Emma and her father in sight. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright with anticipation. "Sarah, how wonderful to hear from you this morning. Are you at the airport already? I know your flight isn't until noon, but you've always been early for everything." "Important." "Mom," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you respond." The silence that followed was pregnant with maternal concern. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "You sound strange. I'm not getting on the plane today." The words hung in the digital space between them, and Sarah could practically hear her mother's careful breathing as she processed this unexpected development. "What do you mean you're not getting on the plane? Is there a problem with the airline?" "A delay?" "No, Mom. I mean I'm not coming home. Not today, and maybe not for a long time." The silence stretched longer this time, and when Patricia Chun finally spoke, her voice carried the particular tone that meant she was working very hard to remain calm. "Sarah, honey, I think you might be having some kind of breakdown. This is a big change, and it's natural to feel nervous about starting over." "But I'm not having a breakdown," Sarah interrupted gently. "I'm having a breakthrough. I've been offered a job here, Mom. A good job working with a special needs child, and I think I want to take it." "A job? Sarah, you have a job. You're a waitress in some tiny town in the middle of nowhere, and you've been miserable for months. That's not a career, that's just marking time until you come to your senses." The dismissive tone in her mother's voice stung more than Sarah had expected, but it also clarified something important. Her mother had never understood that Sarah's work with special needs children wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a way of being in the world that felt authentic and necessary and right. "I know you think I'm making a mistake," Sarah said carefully. "And maybe I am, but it's my mistake to make. Sarah Elizabeth Chen, you are not thinking clearly. You've been working in a diner for 8 months, barely making ends meet, and now some stranger offers you a job and you're ready to throw away everything we've worked toward? What have we worked toward, Mom? Really? A job I don't want in a field I don't care about, married to someone I've never met just because he has a stable income and good insurance. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was small and hurt in a way that made Sarah's chest ache. I just want you to be safe, sweetheart. I want you to have security and stability and all the things I never had when I was raising you alone. The pain in her mother's voice was real and raw, and Sarah felt her resolve waver for a moment. Patricia Chun had sacrificed enormously to give her daughter opportunities she'd never had herself, working multiple jobs and going without countless necessities to ensure that Sarah could attend college and pursue her dreams. The idea of rejecting that sacrifice felt like a betrayal of everything her mother had endured. I know you do, Mom, Sarah said softly. And I love you for wanting to protect me. But safe isn't the same thing as alive. And I haven't felt truly alive in months, not until yesterday, when I met this little girl who sees the world in colors, and somehow saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there. A little girl, Patricia repeated, and Sarah could hear the wheels turning. Sarah, please tell me you're not making life-altering decisions based on the whims of a child you barely. No. I'm making decisions based on the woman I want to be, Sarah corrected. And that woman doesn't run away from difficult things just because they're scary. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, moving through the predictable stages of maternal concern, disbelief, anger, bargaining, and finally, grudging acceptance. By the time Sarah hung up, her mother still wasn't happy about the decision, but she'd agreed to give Sarah 6 months to prove that this wasn't an elaborate form of self-sabotage. When Sarah returned to the bench, she found David and Emma engaged in an elaborate game that seemed to involve arranging stones in patterns that told stories. Emma looked up as Sarah approached, her dark eyes searching her face as if looking for clues about what the phone call had revealed. Did you talk to your mommy? Emma asked. I did. Was she sad about you staying here? Sarah considered how to answer this honestly without burdening Emma with adult complications. She was worried, she said finally. Sometimes when people love you very much, they worry about you making choices that might hurt you. Emma nodded sagely, as if this was a concept she understood all too well. Daddy worries about me a lot, but he's learning that worrying and trusting can happen at the same time. 6 months later, Sarah stood in what had once been David's grandmother's barn, watching 12 children of varying ages work on their morning projects with the kind of focused intensity that spoke of genuine engagement rather than forced compliance. The space had been transformed beyond recognition. Bright learning pods scattered throughout the cavernous interior, each designed to accommodate different sensory needs and learning styles. In one corner, 8-year-old Marcus worked with geometric patterns, his autism allowing him to see mathematical relationships that eluded most adults. Near the large windows, twins Lily and Rose painted watercolors while discussing the emotional weight of different color combinations. At a specially designed sensory station, 6-year-old Caleb rocked gently in a therapy swing while reading aloud to his younger sister Maya, who listened with the rapt attention of someone discovering that words could create entire worlds. But it was Emma who drew Sarah's eye most often. Now 8 and radiant with confidence, she moved between the younger children like a gentle teacher, offering encouragement in her unique way. Your painting sounds like morning birds singing, she told 5-year-old Jasper, whose Down syndrome hadn't prevented him from creating art that took Sarah's breath away. That's a very happy sound. The Riverside Learning Collective had exceeded every expectation Sarah had dared to hold. What had started as a desperate attempt to help one remarkable child had evolved into something that felt almost miraculous. A place where neurodivergent children didn't just learn academic subjects, but discovered their own extraordinary capabilities. Mrs. Chun? The voice belonged to Sophie, a 10-year-old with ADHD whose boundless energy had been channeled into becoming the school's unofficial activity coordinator. Tommy's having a hard morning. His parents are getting divorced, and he's stuck in a worry loop. Sarah looked across the barn to where Tommy sat hunched at his desk, his hands pressed against his ears, despite the fact that the morning was unusually quiet. She could see the telltale signs of escalating anxiety, the rapid breathing, the rigid posture, the way his eyes darted frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape route. "Thank you for noticing, Sophie," Sarah said, already moving toward Tommy's learning pod. "Can you ask Emma to bring the calm-down box?" Emma appeared at Sarah's side before Sophie could even relay the message, carrying a wooden box that had become as essential to their daily routine as textbooks or art supplies. Inside were tools that the children themselves had suggested and refined over months of trial and error. Stress balls with different textures, noise-canceling headphones, laminated cards with breathing exercises, and small objects designed to provide comfort through touch. "Hey, Tommy," Sarah said softly, crouching beside his desk without crowding his personal space. "I can see your worry thoughts are getting really loud right now." Tommy looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his 9-year-old face. His parents' divorce had been contentious and drawn out, and the uncertainty was taking its toll on a child who craved predictability and security. "I keep thinking about what's going to happen," he whispered. "Like, what if I have to choose between Mom and Dad? What if they both get new families and don't want me anymore?" Emma settled cross-legged on the floor beside Tommy's chair, presence calm and undemanding. "When my worry thoughts get too loud, I imagine them as birds flying around in my head," she said in her matter-of-fact way. "Sometimes I have to give them somewhere else to go so they stop making so much noise." She reached into the calm-down box and pulled out a small journal with a rainbow cover. "Want to write them down? Sometimes when you put worry thoughts on paper, they stop bouncing around so much inside your brain." Tommy considered this for a moment, then nodded and accepted the journal. As he began to write, his breathing gradually slowed and his shoulders relaxed slightly. Sarah felt the familiar swell of pride and wonder that came from watching children support each other with a wisdom that seemed to come from some deep, intuitive place. "I'll check on you in a few minutes," Sarah murmured to Tommy, who was now absorbed in transferring his anxieties to paper. "Emma, thank you for helping." "That's what families do," Emma replied simply, and the casual way she'd expanded the definition of family to include everyone in their learning community made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. As Sarah moved through the barn, checking on various projects and offering guidance where needed, she marveled at how naturally the children had formed their own support network. Traditional schools talked about building character and teaching empathy, but the Riverside Learning Collective had created an environment where these qualities emerged organically from children who understood what it felt like to be different. "Sarah?" David's voice carried across the barn as she looked up to see him standing near the entrance with a woman she didn't recognize. "Could you join us for a moment?" Sarah made her way over, noting the professional way the stranger was dressed and the careful way she was observing their learning environment. Government inspector, Sarah thought, or perhaps a social worker conducting one of their routine evaluations. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Dr. Amanda Rodriguez," David said. "She's from the State Department of Education, and she's here to observe our program." Dr. Rodriguez extended her hand with a smile that seemed genuine rather than merely professional. "I've been hearing remarkable things about what you've accomplished here," she said. "The state is very interested in your approach to neurodivergent education." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. State attention could be wonderful funding, recognition, Official validation, but it could also mean increased oversight, bureaucratic requirements, and the kind of standardization that might strip away the very qualities that made their program effective. "We're happy to answer any questions you have," Sarah said carefully. "Actually, I'm here with a proposal," Dr. Rodriguez said. "The state has been looking for innovative programs to serve as models for special education reform. Your outcomes are extraordinary, not just academically, but in terms of social and emotional development. We'd like to offer you substantial funding to expand." Sarah and David exchanged glances. They discussed the possibility of growth many times, but always in theoretical terms. The reality of state backing felt both exciting and overwhelming. "What would expansion look like?" David asked. "Initially, funding for 30 additional students, resources for teacher training, and support for facility improvements," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Eventually, we'd like to see programs like this established in districts throughout the state." It was everything Sarah had dreamed of and more, the chance to help hundreds of children rather than dozens, to train other educators in their methods, to create a network of schools where neurodivergent children could flourish. But it was also terrifying in its implications. "Can we have some time to discuss this?" Sarah asked. "Of course. I'll be observing for the rest of the day, and then I'd like to schedule a formal meeting with your board of directors." After Dr. Rodriguez moved away to continue her observations, Sarah and David stood in comfortable silence, both processing the magnitude of what had just been offered. "It's what we always said we wanted," David said quietly. "I know, but—" Sarah watched Emma helping Caleb with a particularly challenging math problem, her patience infinite as she explained concepts in the visual language that worked best for his learning style. "But I keep thinking about what happened at my last job, how success became more important than the children themselves. This is different," David said firmly. "We have control here. We set the standards, do we? Once the state is involved, once there are funding requirements and oversight committees and performance metrics." David nodded, understanding her concerns without her having to articulate them fully. They'd both seen what happened when bureaucracy overtook mission, when the needs of the system became more important than the needs of the individuals it was supposed to serve. "We don't have to decide today," he said. "Let's see what Dr. Rodriguez observes, what questions she asks. Maybe we can find a way to grow without losing what makes this place special." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Rodriguez moved through the learning spaces with obvious appreciation, stopping to observe individual interactions and asking thoughtful questions about their teaching methods. Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic about the woman's genuine interest in their approach rather than just their test scores. During lunch, the children gathered in the main house's dining room, their conversations a delightful mix of academic discussions, social planning, and the kind of silly humor that reminded Sarah they were still children despite their extraordinary insights. "Dr. Rodriguez," Emma said during a lull in the conversation, "would you like to know about our color system?" "I'd love to, Doctor," Rodriguez replied, settling into her chair with the relaxed attention that suggested she understood the importance of listening to children's perspectives. "Most schools teach everyone the same way and expect everyone to learn the same way," Emma explained with the confidence of someone who'd given this explanation many times. "But that's like trying to paint a picture using only one color. It might work for some parts, but you miss all the beautiful combinations that make things interesting. So what do you do differently here?" "We figure out what color each person learns best in," Emma continued. "Tommy learns best in blue, that's calm and structured and predictable. Sophie learns best in orange, that's energetic and creative, and always moving. I learn best in purple and gold, that's intuitive and musical and sees patterns that other people miss." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "And how do your teachers accommodate these different colors?" "They don't just accommodate them," 10-year-old Marcus interjected. They celebrate them. Like, my autism means I see mathematical patterns that neurotypical people can't see. Instead of trying to make me more normal, they help me use my pattern seeing to solve problems and help other kids understand concepts differently. And it's not just academic, added Sophie. When Tommy's parents were fighting a lot, Emma helped him create a worry journal, and Lily taught him breathing exercises, and Marcus showed him how to use math problems to calm his brain down. We all help each other because we all understand what it's like to be different. Sarah watched Dr. Rodriguez's expression shift from professional interest to something deeper recognition, perhaps of what these children had articulated so naturally. This wasn't just an innovative educational approach. It was a fundamental reimagining of how human beings could support and celebrate each other's differences. After lunch, Dr. Rodriguez asked to speak privately with Sarah and David. They settled. In David's study, surrounded by the books and family photographs that made the space feel welcoming rather than formal. I have to be honest with you, Dr. Rodriguez began. When I came here today, I was expecting to see a well-run program for special needs children. What I've observed is something much more profound. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. In what way? You've created a community where neurodivergent children don't just receive support, they provide it. Where differences are treated as assets rather than deficits. Where social and emotional learning happens organically because the environment itself teaches empathy and mutual respect. That's always been our goal, David said. And you've achieved it in ways that most traditional schools can only dream of, Dr. Rodriguez continued. But here's my concern. The moment we try to systematize this, the moment we create protocols and standards and measurable outcomes, we risk destroying the very magic that makes it work. Sarah felt a rush of relief. Dr. Rodriguez understood the delicate balance they'd worked so hard to maintain. So what are you suggesting? Sarah asked. I'm suggesting we approach this differently than I originally planned, Dr. Rodriguez said. Instead of immediate expansion, what if we started with a pilot program? Select a small number of educators to spend extended time here, learning not just your methods but your philosophy. Then support them in creating similar programs in their own communities, adapted to local needs and cultures. A train-the-trainers model, David said thoughtfully. Exactly. And instead of state oversight, we provide resources and support while allowing each program to develop its own identity and approach. Sarah felt excitement building in her chest. This was the kind of growth that could honor their original mission while extending their impact far beyond what they could achieve in one location. There's one more thing, Dr. Rodriguez added. We'd like Emma to be involved in the training process. Her ability to articulate the student perspective, combined with her natural teaching instincts, could be invaluable for educators who are learning to see through neurodivergent eyes. Before Sarah could respond, there was a soft knock on the study door. Emma peered around the frame, her expression curious but polite. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but Tommy wanted me to tell you that his worry journal helped so much that he wants to start a worry-sharing circle for other kids whose parents are getting divorced. The timing was perfect, Sarah realized. Here was Emma, demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership and empathy that made their program extraordinary. Emma, Dr. Rodriguez said gently, how would you feel about helping teach other teachers about what makes your school special? Emma considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. Would I get to meet other kids like me? Kids who learn in different colors? You would. And would I get to help them feel less alone? You would. Emma's smile was radiant. Then yes, I think that would be a very good use of my colors. After Dr. Rodriguez left with promises to send formal proposals within the week, Sarah found herself standing in the garden behind the main house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades that Emma would undoubtedly describe as musical. The day had brought possibilities she'd never dared to imagine, along with the familiar terror that came with success, Penny for your thoughts?" David's voice was warm as he joined her among the late-blooming roses. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Sarah admitted. "For someone to tell us we're doing everything wrong, or that we don't have the proper credentials, or that our methods don't align with state standards. And instead, they want to replicate what we've built. They want to train other teachers to do what we're doing. They want Emma to help lead the effort." David was quiet for a moment, watching the children who were still outside enjoying the mild evening, some reading in the garden, others engaged in elaborate games that seemed to involve equal parts imagination and advanced physics. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked finally. Sarah considered the question honestly. 6 months ago, she'd been a failed teacher hiding in a dead-end job, convinced that her passion for helping children was more liability than asset. Now she was co-directing a program that was being held up as a model for educational innovation, with opportunities to impact thousands of children rather than dozens. "No," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "No second thoughts, just amazement, I guess. 6 months ago, I was ready to give up on ever finding my place in the world. Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, even though it's scary." "Especially because it's scary," Sarah replied. "The things worth doing are usually the things that scare us most." Emma appeared at Sarah's elbow, as she had a habit of doing when important conversations were taking place. "Are you talking about the doctor's visit?" she asked with her characteristic directness. "We are," David confirmed. "What did you think of her proposal?" Emma tilted her head to one side, her expression thoughtful. "I think she has very bright colors," she said. "The kind that means she really wants to help kids, not just look good for her boss. And I think it would be good to teach other teachers how to see children's colors properly." "You're not worried about things changing here?" Sarah asked. "Things change anyway," Emma said with the philosophical acceptance that had always amazed Sarah. "The question is whether they change in ways that help more kids or in ways that hurt them. I think this will help." Later that evening, after the children had been picked up by their families and the barn had been tidied for the next day, Sarah found herself back in her cottage, surrounded by the lesson plans and assessment tools that had become the foundation of their educational approach. On her desk sat Emma's original wooden box, still filled with the pieces of happy music that had helped Sarah find her way home. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw the article in the Education Journal about your program. So proud of you, sweetheart. You found your calling after all." The article Dr. Rodriguez had mentioned was just the beginning, Sarah realized. Soon there would be more visitors, more attention, more opportunities and challenges than she could currently imagine. The small, intimate community they'd built would necessarily become part of something larger and more complex. But as she looked out her window at the main house, where David was probably reading Emma a bedtime story while she arranged her collections in their mysterious but meaningful patterns, Sarah felt only gratitude. She'd been given a second chance at the work she'd always been meant to do, with people who understood that love and professional boundaries weren't mutually exclusive. Her phone rang, and she smiled when she saw the number. "Marcus?" She answered, "Miss Chen, guess what?" The voice on the other end was bright with excitement. Marcus from her previous job, now 12 years old and thriving in his home environment. "What's happening, kiddo?" "I got accepted into the gifted program at my new school, and they want me to help design curriculum for other kids with autism. My mom said it was because you taught me that being different could be a superpower instead of a problem." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "That's wonderful, Marcus. I'm so proud of you, Miss Chun. I know you're doing amazing things at your new school. My mom showed me the articles. I just wanted you to know that you changed my life, and now I get to help change other kids' lives too. It's like the good things you do keep growing and spreading, even when you don't know about it." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about ripple effects and unintended consequences in the way kindness could multiply across time and distance in ways that defied measurement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new children who needed someone to see their unique colors and help them shine. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, in a cottage surrounded by gardens, in a community built on acceptance and understanding, in a life that had found her when she'd stopped running from herself long enough to let it catch up. Outside her window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the main house, Emma was probably explaining to her father why the constellation patterns made certain musical sounds and how those sounds helped her understand the mathematical relationships between celestial bodies. Sarah smiled and began planning tomorrow's lessons, humming softly under her breath. The melody was one Emma had taught her, a song that sounded like courage looked, purple and gold like happy music, rising and falling with the rhythm of hope itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.